Welcome to Read with Maren. In our last video, Joe and Mary Alice were rummaging through the attic, and now we're about to find out that was all part of Grandma's plot to save Effie Wilcox's home from the bank. The end of Chapter 6, coming up next. Let's begin. That afternoon, we walked uptown and a block beyond to the United Brethren Church. We weren't going for the lunch the ladies' circle was selling. We ate at home, but Grandma said they'd be offering free lemonade. She had taken off her apron and wore a hat. Not her fine, fair-going hat. This was the one she gardened in and fished in, nibbled at the brim. She had stuck a fresh peony in the front of the crown to dress it up. She strolled along over the occasional sidewalks with the preacher's stovepipe hat and a grocery bag. Mary Alice wore her straw hat and a dress because we were going to church, more or less. I brought up the rear with Aunt Josie Schmoll's quilt folded over my sweating arm. "What's a church rummage sale like anyway?" Mary Alice asked. "Ever been to a hen house?" Grandma said. The sale was in the church basement. The air was battered by funeral parlor fans, and the ladies were picking over long tables. Some were still bringing in their treasures and trash. Others were snatching things up and taking them to the cashier's card table to pay for them. A sharp scent of potato salad hung in the air, but the ladies' circle had cleared away lunch. Now they were bringing out pitchers of free lemonade. Everybody looked up when Grandma loomed into the room, as people always did. Several pulled back, but a tall, strict-looking lady came forth. "Why, goodness, it's Mrs. Dowdel," she said. Grandma made short work of her by handing over the grocery bag and nodding at the quilt, which I offered up. Mary Alice went for a look at the merchandise, but the tables were surrounded by flying elbows, so I sat next to Grandma. She was on a folding chair, pouring herself a glass of lemonade. She had a way of sitting with her feet apart and her hands on her knees. After a good long swig of lemonade, she observed the scene. In fact, she was biding her time. Somehow, I knew this. A flurry began at the other end of the table. From their hats, they were all town ladies, not country. A hiss of whispers whipped up into raised voices. Grandma sat on, at her ease. Then the strict lady in charge, who was Mrs. Earl T. Askew, came through the crowds heading for us. Mrs. Askew's face had gone vampire white. Bending to Grandma, she spoke in low, urgent tones. "Mrs. Dowdel, I feel that I must tell you that Mrs. L.J. Weidenbach, the banker's wife, has offered $15 for the stovepipe hat." She stared at Grandma for a reaction and got nothing back. "Mrs. Dowdel, are you 100% sure you want to part with that?" "It don't belong to me." Grandma made a small gesture. "I have an idea it was in with some of the other old stuff that Effie Wilcox threw away when the bank run her out of town." Mrs. Askew's gaze was electric. "Other old stuff?" She seemed to be having trouble breathing. Grandma nodded. "Just old clutter Effie had found in the house back when she moved in." Mrs. Askew pivoted like a dancer and was gone. Already, Mrs. L.J. Weidenbach was over at the cashier, peeling off $5 bills as fast as she could dig them out of her pocketbook. "Oh, Grandma," I thought, "what have you done?" Mrs. Askew plunged back. Aunt Josie Schmoll's quilt was clutched in her arms like a long-lost child. "Mrs. Dowdel," she said. "Oh, Mrs. Dowdel, are you 100%? Grandma took the quilt into her lap, smoothed it out, and looked it over. A crowd had gathered. There in the corner, worked in faded thread, initials had magically appeared in the fraying hem. M.T.L. Suddenly, Mrs. Weidenbach appeared, gripping the preacher's stovepipe hat. She went right for Mrs. Askew. "What have you got there? Let me—" "Not so fast, Wilhelmina," Mrs. Askew snapped. "I saw it first." She swept up the quilt that Grandma had gladly surrendered. "What are those initials?" Mrs. Weidenbach was beside herself. "Oh, my stars and garters! MTL! Mary Todd Lincoln! And I've got Abe Lincoln's own stovepipe hat. His name is lettered in the sweatband. 2 things happened that next morning. A car from out of town backfired in the vicinity of the bank, and everybody on the sidewalk dropped down and grabbed gravel. Who knew but what John Dillinger was alive and well and up to his old tricks? The other thing was a knock at Grandma's front door right after breakfast. Mary Alice and I followed when she went to answer it, opening to a stringy young guy in a seersucker suit. "Well, Otis, what?" "Ma'am," he said, "Mr. Weidenbach would be pleased if you could spare him a moment of your time at your earliest convenience." Grandma stepped back and clutched her throat, showing shock. "Don't tell me the bank's failed. Banks is failing all over. Had I better draw out my funds? Is there time?" "No, ma'am, the bank is still in business." Otis looked down at his boots. "Your $17 is safe." "You give me a turn," she said, slapping at her bosom and shutting the door in his face. She waited an hour and a half, and then she put on her gardening hat and went up to the bank. Mary Alice and I went with her. When we got to the business block, people were still just getting up off the sidewalk. The bank was store-sized, and the only teller was Otis, back in his cage. He waved us through to the rear office beside the safe. I've never seen Mr. Weidenbach before, but this couldn't have been one of his better days. Over his head on the wall, above the desk, was a wide-mouthed bass, stuffed. "You will have to excuse me," he boomed, showing us the chairs. "This crack-brained rumor that Dillinger is still alive is doing our business no good." "If it's a rumor at all," said Grandma, on her dignity and then some. "A rumor is sometimes truth on the trail." "I am interested to hear you say so, Mrs. Dowdel." The banker pulled the purse strings of his mouth taut. "It brings us to the point." "Get right to it," Grandma said. "Certain items, supposedly from the estate of President and Mrs. Abraham Lincoln, have surfaced in the house that the bank has forced to foreclose on. Do you grasp what this could mean, Mrs. Dowdel?" Grandma thought she did. "I expect the state will take that land and restore the house as a museum. I hear a rumor that Lincoln debated Douglas in that very parlor. Rumor has it he split the rails for the fence that used to enclose the brickyard." "And who has been circulating such cockeyed rumors?" The banker turned a deeper color. "Who knows where rumors start?" Grandma mused. "Who knows where it'll end? They very likely heard it at the State House in Springfield by now, and I have an idea they'll send over a historian any day now to snoop. Mrs. Dowdel, the bank has signed papers with Deere and Company to build an implement shed across that entire property and the site of the old brickyard, too. Any delay throws a monkey wrench in the deal. Better times are on the way, and what's good for the bank is good for the community." "But a nice state park wouldn't be bad either," Grandma pondered. "We could all set out on summer evenings recalling Honest Abe. That park we got now is just wasteland that the Wabash Railroad didn't want." Mr. Weidenbach's gaping mouth hung near his blotter now. He had his desktop in a death grip. "Mrs. Dowdel, you falsified those so-called Lincoln items. They're bogus. I could have the law on you." "That's right." Grandma gazed above him at the wide-mouthed bass. "The banker throws the old widder in the pokey. That'll look real good for your business." Mr. Weidenbach was smaller now, deflated. "Mrs. Dowdel," he said in a voice strangled with emotion, "help me out of this. I'm in too deep with John Deere. I got to go forward because I can't do otherwise." "Lop off your back end," Grandma said. "I beg your pardon?" "Build a shorter implement shed over the old brickyard and leave Effie Wilcox's house be." A glimmer of hope showed in the banker's hard eye. "I suppose we could go back to the drawing board and reallocate our square footage." "Do that," Grandma said. "And one more thing. You give Effie Wilcox back her house free and clear. It isn't worth nothing anyway. apart from its historical value. Mrs. Dowdel, that's not business, that's blackmail. What's the difference? Grandma said. A silence was observed. Then Banker Weidenbach turned up his hands. All right, it's Mrs. Wilcox's house free and clear, but you'll have to confess that you falsified those so-called Lincoln items. Fair's fair. Oh, well, Grandma sketched a casual pattern in the air with one hand. We can get that rumor going right now. Effie didn't mean to put Lincoln's name in the stovepipe hat. She lettered A. Lincoln to mean it was the kind of hat that he wore. Mary Alice and I exchanged a look across Grandma. And that MTL on the quilt? Psh! Effie Wilcox had a cousin, name of Maud Teeter Lingenbloom. That's MTL for you. Mr. Weidenbach replied with an exhausted voice. I'll get the word out. Grandma was on her feet now. She patted the bun in the back of her hair under the nibbled brim. Free and clear, you got that? She said to Mr. Weidenbach. Effie don't make no more payments on that house. Then, as if a sudden thought struck her, she nudged me. And you can give this boy here a $2 bill. She nudged Mary Alice. And fair's fair. Give this girl $2 too. Well, that's big money for young'uns, the banker said. Shall I draw it out of your account, Mrs. Dowdel? No, you double-dealing, four-flushing old cootie. You can draw it out of your own wallet. Any man with a wife who will pay $15 for an old preacher's moth-eaten stovepipe hat has $4 to spare. Silent wars seemed to wage on in Mr. Weidenbach's brain. Then he pulled out his wallet out of his hip pocket. He kept a bootlace tied around it. We watched as he drew out a pair of $2 bills and handed them to Mary Alice and me. And heaven help us, we took them. Rumors are things with wings, too. The rumor that I had $2 reached Ray Veach before I could. He was going to have to give me my driving lessons at the end of the day when he was sure his dad was out on the farm, milking. Otherwise, his dad would take a cut. Also, we needed to use the Terraplane 8, which was strictly forbidden under an agreement with the Hudson Motor Car Company. I started off to Ray's that evening with a $2 bill in my jeans and a song in my heart. Grandma came to the depot with us on the day we were going home, but she wasn't there to see us off. She was there to meet Mrs. Effie Wilcox, who was coming home to her house. The Wabash Bluebird didn't exactly stop at Grandma's town. It only hesitated. As we were struggling to climb on, Mrs. Wilcox was struggling to get off. Her valise was full to bursting, and her eyes were everywhere, so I don't know if she spotted Grandma at first. But then somehow Mary Alice and I got our suitcase on board, and Mrs. Wilcox was on the platform, and the Bluebird was pulling out. Grandma didn't wave. Mrs. Wilcox was telling her something, but we waved anyway. We'll pause there for now. I love seeing how Joe and Mary Alice are growing closer to their grandmother through these summer trips, no matter how bizarre the things they go through are. They're starting to see things with different eyes, in a different light, through the view of Grandma and all of her life lessons. I love family. I'm grateful to know how important family is. And I've come to realize, even through this story, that family isn't just who we're born with. It's the people that we're close to, our neighbors, the people we go to church with, sometimes our friends that we're dear friends with for a long time. But what we learn is that just like within traditional families, we have a responsibility to care for one another, to do what we can to make life good for each other, and to be the very best we can be. Let's always remember that as we go through our daily lives. And as always, remember to look for the good in the world. And if you have trouble finding it, create a little of it yourself. We'll see you next time. That afternoon. Oh, let's begin. Waiting for the lunch. And we're about. Why am I having so much trouble? On the quilt, not on the hat. If I only had a brain. A really cool. Anybody? Is it just me? Just me?